This is Matt Pillar, and you're listening to the Business of Biotech. Now, I often like to invite guests on the show who bring unique combinations of experiences to their leadership of the biopharmas that we cover. And as such, I'll often use this intersection analogy, as in our guest sits at the intersection of Wall Street and biotech or some such thing. But if I try that analogy on with my guest today, it would paint the picture of a very, very busy intersection. He is an accomplished attorney, having earned his JD at Harvard before practicing at Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, a tier one firm catering to the highest of Silicon Valley high techs. He did some big time stuff while there, guiding the sale of Steve Jobs' then company Next to Apple, for instance. His further experience in the Valley includes founding a global web-based IT services platform. When he turned his attention to the life sciences, he became CEO of a European med device company and served as head of the pulmonary business unit at Nectar Therapeutics prior to negotiating the sale of that division to Novartis. During his tenure there, he spun two other entities out of Nectar, including Pearl Therapeutics, acquired in 2013 by AstraZeneca for a cool $1 billion. And then a little over 10 years ago, he founded Rezolute Bio, now known as Rezolute. His name is Nevan Charles Elam, and I'm thrilled that he's joined us. Nevan, welcome to the show.
Matt, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. And needless to say, from my intro there, your professional backstory is incredibly diverse. And I want to start there. I want to start with sort of your thoughts on how your career, which winds through high tech and corporate law and healthcare and eventually into the life sciences and biopharma, how has all that experience, and I know it's a great, big, giant, wide open question, but how has all that experience prepared you for this leadership role that you now have in a biopharmaceutical firm?
Thanks, Matt. It definitely is a winding road if I look back at my career over the last nearly 30 years. And it probably begins with the fact that I was born and raised in Silicon Valley. So I was steeped in all things semiconductor. That's what my father did back in the days of Fairchild, pre-Intel. And so growing up in that environment in the 1970s and 1980s definitely gave me a sense of entrepreneurship and the spirit, as we like to say, of the Valley and the can-do attitude. So through that, returning back to the Valley after school, I had a very diverse legal practice, and that legal practice spanned everything from IT to life science companies, companies working on novel therapeutics and others working on things that would eventually become Bluetooth. And through that journey, you learn a lot. You see success that companies experience, and you also see what constitutes failure and the challenges that companies encounter. And it was clear to me that being in the ivory tower in a law firm was nice, but I really wanted to also get my hands a little dirty and be on the management side and try to develop something and be active in the business community, looking at, in this case, developing therapies. So it is a winding path for sure. I think each of us makes our way in our career, and it's probably rarely a straight line. And mine has ended, or at least began and is culminated in really pursuing therapies for challenging diseases.
Yeah. Well, talk about a challenge. I mean, you set yourself up for a challenge that, you mentioned being in a position where you have some sense of authority over success and failure in the IT space, which, I've covered I covered for 20 years before coming to life sciences. Failure is a thing, but it's not quite as big a thing as it is in this business. I mean, you did you know coming in that you were entering a business that, I mean, the failure rate, far outpaces the success rate?
Absolutely. I definitely jumped into biopharmaceuticals eyes wide open, having spent the 1990s watching my clients. And the real difference here is measurement, right? How you measure time in IT and in that environment, or now in the things that we look at in web-based apps and cloud solutions. Time is measured in months and quarters versus in biopharmaceuticals where you're measuring 7 to 10 years potentially of developing a therapy, bringing that therapy to fruition and eventually approval. So it's a completely different environment. So I knew, having worked with companies in the earlier days like Genentech as clients, how long and difficult that path could be. And to your point, the failure rate is high versus saying being on the engineering side, where you have a challenge that you're trying to solve, whether how fast you can speed up a network. And it's an engineering challenge that may take months, but eventually you can probably solve that challenge.
Yeah.
Whereas the human body, well, you may develop a therapy, but we have no idea how the human body is going to ultimately respond to it, or what side effects will be generated from that therapy.
Yeah.
Or even if you develop a therapy, how hard it is to manufacture and reproduce that therapy.
Yeah. Yeah. So still, obviously, to your point, you had some experience with biopharma clients, and then some life sciences experience. Still a pretty big leap to jump into, founding a biopharma company. Tell us about, I guess the origin story. What inspired you to launch the company, and if we can dovetail, your inspiration to launch the company, and then the inspiration behind Rezolute's mission around developing targeted therapies for metabolic diseases. Do those kind of meet somewhere?
They do indeed. And happy to talk about that. As it is for myself and my career, having been a senior executive at a much larger public biotech company, and having managed many programs, but still having that entrepreneurship steeped in my blood from childhood, watching my father and his friends and others developing companies in Silicon Valley, wanted to do the same. And the passion, at least for me, was very clear, having worked in different diseases. So I spent a lot of time working in metabolic disease and rare diseases. And metabolic disease, I was fortunate to have one drug partnered with Pfizer that was ultimately approved, and was the first inhaled insulin at my company. And that inhaled insulin was a chance for individuals who suffer with diabetes during mealtime to be able to take a puff of insulin rather than inject themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's arguably convenient, but it also changes a paradigm of how socially we interact. The drug was eventually, after it was approved, it was clear it was not going to be a multi-billion-dollar drug. And so for marketing reasons, Pfizer ended up terminating the marketing of the drug. But when that happened, I received hundreds of letters from patients all over the world, from Kentucky to Spain, saying, what happened to my drug? Where is it? It's changed my life. It's changed how I go about interacting socially and engaging with the world. And that's when you realize that the therapies you're developing, even when it's something that could be arguably convenient, have a tremendous impact. And that's when it really comes home. Mm-hmm. So looking at the metabolic space and realizing that there's definitely a need. The metabolic encompasses so much of the human body, everything from how we regulate the temperature of the human body to the food that we ingest, and our blood sugar levels, and the horrible things like diabetes when those things are out of whack. It's very, very telling. And I believe that while others have expertise in oncology and a mission to do that, there's also a huge unmet need for a lot of diseases and rare diseases that affect our overall metabolism. Mm-hmm. And I guess related to that would probably be the case that, working on other therapies that are rare diseases, I spent time around cystic fibrosis. And cystic fibrosis is a horrible, horrible disease, and often starts in childhood. And watching children suffer with the disease, I can't think of anything more, particularly as a parent, that's distressful than looking at a young child, suffering with an intractable disease. And so ultimately for me, working in the metabolic space and hopefully targeting therapies that could impact in a positive way children, to me, is kind of the holy grail of a life's mission professionally. Yeah, that's great. Well, so let's talk about the therapy itself. Tell me about RZ358, which is your monoclonal antibody targeting congenital hyperinsulinism. And if we could kind of start with what we know at this point about the disease, and then kind of move from there into the therapies that you're developing. Sure, happy to do so. Congenital hyperinsulinism is a very rare disease. It usually presents within the first month of life, definitely by the first year of life. It affects about 1 in 30,000 live births. So you're talking single-digit thousands of patients in the US, similar population, for example, in Europe, but it's also worldwide. And it depends on genetics, because there are 12 different genetic mutations that we know of that cause the disease or attributable to the disease. And in some patient populations, for example, in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, it's 1 in 2,500 live births, so much higher incidence rate in different populations. The disease itself is extremely debilitating. There is no cure today. There is no approved treatment for the disease today as well. And what it is, it's the easiest way to describe it, is kind of the opposite of diabetes. This is when children, regardless of blood sugar levels, overproduce insulin right at birth. And so when you're overproducing insulin, insulin is signaling to our downstream cells and tissues and encouraging those cells to uptake glucose. But if there's too much insulin, then you're starving the body of energy. And most importantly for children, energy for the brain. And when you're starving the brain, that's particularly problematic. And as we've seen, it's upwards of about 50% of the children with the disease have neurological impairment. So really, really debilitating disease. The treatment options that have been used and are still used today range from using drugs that, again, were not approved for the therapy, but have an effect on trying to stop the insulin production. One drug, for example, is a drug diazoxide that is used, and it is effective in about 40% of the children in stopping the production of insulin. But it comes with a whole host of nasty side effects. Everything from extensive hair growth on the children to black box warning for pulmonary hypertension. It has to be co-administered with diuretics. So not an ideal therapy, but it does work in a certain segment of that patient population. Regionally, other solutions involve surgery. So, for example, in Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which is one of the leading centers in the world studying the disease and treating patients, surgery is used, particularly if there's a lesion on the pancreas that is focal and can be surgically removed. That can be done, and that can be curative. This gets a little more complicated if the disease is diffuse and spread throughout the pancreas. That may require multiple surgeries and may end up leaving the child with in a state of diabetes. So a very tough landscape, not many therapies in development. And if you can imagine back to, as I described, that what it must be to have a child who you're constantly monitoring 24 hours a day to make sure their blood sugar levels aren't going excessively low and starving their body of energy, it's a nightmare. And having spent time with the patients and their families and parents and hearing the stories, extremely difficult landscape to manage. So that's the short story of a background of the disease. The disease itself usually does tend to age out, so children may start at birth with the disease. We don't know all the reasons why, but often by the time they're 18, 19 years old, the disease tends to get better. And that may just be because the pancreas is burning itself out, producing so much insulin. Having said that, there are patients in their 20s, 30s, 40s that still have severe disease. So there's a lot of heterogeneity and definitely a massive unmet need. Yeah.
So what's the backstory on pursuit of a monoclonal antibody as a therapeutic? I'm curious as to, you mentioned some other treatment options which decidedly are not biologic per se. So what's the story there? How did we land on, hey, let's try a mAb?
Yeah, the idea of using an antibody really is, and I think this is part of the advancement that we've seen in the last 25 years of therapeutic development, and the concept that's being touted in a significant way in oncology, for example. And that is really looking at therapeutics that are targeting specific aspects of a disease, or in some cases, genetics. Our antibody is not targeting genetics, but instead looking at developing a therapy that can reduce the impact or the effect of all of the excess insulin in the human body. So using an antibody is really a targeted approach as a biologic. And so this antibody that we're bringing forward, RZ358, into late-stage clinical development, was actually developed in concert with Children's Hospital of Philadelphia through a screening process looking at an antibody platform to look for a specific antibody as a protein that would have the effect on the insulin receptor to the desired effect to be able to reduce insulin's signaling and binding affinity, which is what the antibody does. So it was a very targeted approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you give us some insight into the manufacturing approach there? Are there, tell us about the manufacturing approach, anything that's sort of novel about it, and then we can talk about perhaps development challenges that you faced along the way.
Sure. I'm happy to do so. The manufacturing process and, antibodies really since the mid 1980s have gone through evolution in terms of how they're manufactured through the animal cell line using mice. And we've made a variety of evolution to get to what we have now, which is a fully human monoclonal antibody. Which is great because it reduces adverse impact or adverse effects that you would expect to see in a patient when a fully human monoclonal antibody is used. And the manufacturing process now is pretty much streamlined. So you actually look at taking the antibody and you have to purify it through a cell line. There's a master cell bank. And then it's about scaling it, usually a 100-liter single-use bioreactor up to 1,000, 2,000 single-use bioreactor. So that purification process and then scaling it to be able then to apply it to a therapeutic. So there are worldwide sophisticated manufacturers that are manufacturing antibodies as we speak. In the last 15 years in particular, the manufacturing process is very matured and high levels of predictability and a lot of expertise around the table.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. This April, Cytiva celebrates 1 year in the biopharma industry, 12 groundbreaking and revolutionary months working to navigate and overcome the worst viral pandemic in a century. In recognizing this key milestone, we have the opportunity to reflect on lessons learned and identify ways to innovate, adapt, and improve. To help drive this progress, visit Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator and check out a selection of helpful resources for biotech leaders at cytiva.com/emergingbiotech. Is Rezolute doing that in-house, or are you working with an outsourcing partner?
No, we are definitely not doing it in-house. It is an undertaking for a contract manufacturer, CDMO, to really leverage their expertise. We have a core team on our CMC side, so chemistry, manufacturing, and controls team that manages our third parties. And so that team has a lot of expertise, both working with antibodies as well as just in general manufacture of therapeutics. And so we work with our partners, and I like to definitely think of them as our partners. They're not vendors because we are, really joined at the hip with the success of a program. Because if they can't manufacture the antibody or manufacture it timely, that has a massive impact clearly on our business.
Sure. Were there any specific, developmental hurdles or challenges along the way that you had to overcome and kind of lead the team through?
I would say that because the process itself has really been refined and it's streamlined, and there are multiple organizations that can produce the antibody with that expertise. One of the challenges actually is just getting space, getting a space in line to be able to have a manufacturing run and to have lots that are actually produced, put on stability, checked, verified through the quality process before ready to be used in the human. So when you talk about long lead times, that can be a year, year and a half, 2 years if you think you need a new batch of material to be able to take forward into a clinical study or ultimately into commercial. So while there is expertise, there's a lot of demand and a lot of demand for antibody manufacture. And so one of the biggest challenges is long lead time planning because it's expensive. So the capital investment up front may be large, and you may not realize the result, meaning drug that's ready for use for 2.5 years later.
Yeah. What's your, what's your personal kind of outlook on that? it seems as though there are new CMOs opening their doors all the time. I've read reports recently that say within the next couple of years, the majority of quote unquote drug product produced in the United States will be biologic drug product. I mean, it's obviously a very fast growing area. Are you seeing any signs that perhaps the manufacturing space is starting to catch up with the demand and the promise of biologic therapies manufacturing?
We were absolutely up until I think the pandemic with COVID-19. The demand on most manufacturers has been overwhelming, where there's shortages of vials, of glass, of all kinds of the basic tools in the toolkit that are used for manufacture. So hopefully on the back end of the current pandemic, we will see a new normal, including in terms of manufacturing capability, and not just capability, but to your point, other manufacturers that may come online, and just overall greater capacity, because capacity constraint, that's the issue today. Yeah, for sure. So I want to talk about your rare pediatric disease designation. So you received that last summer for RZ358. And I mean, as you know, our show is consumed by leaders of new and emerging biotechs, a lot of them first-time leaders of new and emerging biotechs. So give us some insight and advice into what went into receiving that designation, and what you as a company had to do to put it together, and what it means for the future of the candidate. Sure, Matt. The rare disease designation is something that was put in place about 15 years ago. Or actually 2007 timeframe by the FDA, tied with a priority review voucher, which I'll come to in a second. But it really is to drive companies to develop therapies for challenging diseases that are specifically pediatric. So it's an incentive that the FDA put in place, that if you can develop a therapy with a high unmet need, with a significant pediatric population, then you would be eligible for this designation. And so what we've seen in the last 12, 13 years or so is companies have applied for that designation with this voucher that comes with the designation. And the reason why that's significant is the voucher is something that a company can use for its next therapeutic. And so what the FDA says is that typically the time towards looking at approval of a therapeutic is about 10 months. And if you have a voucher, the FDA in effect says you can skip the line and truncate that time period to about 6 months. It may not sound like a lot, but if you're launching a blockbuster drug in your larger pharma, every month can mean tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of potential revenue, especially in a competitive environment. And so what we've seen in the last, again, 10 or so years is smaller companies that are developing for a rare disease that's pediatric, getting the voucher upon approval. So in our case, for example, RZ358, if we made it through phase 3 and we actually got the therapy approved, we would then be eligible for the voucher. And you've often seen these small companies, such as ourselves, because we are not one of the large pharmaceutical companies, actually monetizing those vouchers. And typically they go for in the neighborhood of $100 million. You can actually sell to larger pharma. So that is the notability of the rare disease designation coupled with the voucher itself. Yeah. Well, congratulations on that. It's certainly exciting, and I'm sure it was it's a shot in the arm as far as future progress is concerned. Absolutely. At least it potential that could be realized as we progress. I hope so. Yeah. Okay. So give us the highlights of the clinical journey. You entered into phase 2B, a phase 2B trial last winter. Is that correct? That's correct. We did, and so we're doing a global study in this disease. And when you work in rare diseases, one of the things that I really like working in rare diseases is that it's often a tight-knit community. So there is Congenital Hyperinsulinism International, which is the patient advocacy group. They're very active with a registry of patients, as well as promoting therapies, potential therapies for patients. and bringing together physicians. So there are a number of physicians worldwide, whether you're in Turkey, Bulgaria, China, and of course in the US, that actually treat these patients and treat these children and deal with the same issues regardless of geography. And so we wanted to make sure that we put together a late-stage program that was robust. So our study is the RISE study, with a Z, of course, to go with Rezolute. And we did launch that in more than 10 countries, and just before the start of the pandemic. And we've been working our way through that, and it's nice now to be in a position as the pandemic abates in certain geographies to begin screening patients again as we look to complete that study. Yeah. So the study itself it's about 24 patients where they're given multiple doses of our therapeutic, and we would then look to see how we are impacting their episodes of hypoglycemia. So it's a robust study. We screen the patients for 10 days before they are dosed, and then look to take a variety of measurements throughout the study, and are hopeful that we will demonstrate that we can have a significant impact on reducing the hypoglycemic episodes and duration of those episodes. And we're measuring all of that in a very, very direct way.
Yeah, very cool. How taxing was it, or distracting or cumbersome was it to deal with the pandemic as you're moving through this study? I mean, you mentioned that it's a global study, which is obviously gives you a good diverse patient population. To your point, it gives you access to some areas that perhaps are not as affected at the present time by the pandemic. But at the same time, it's got to be limiting. There have to be limiting circumstances you've had to battle through.
Yeah, Matt, we definitely did have to battle through, and this is one of the challenges of being a small company. Not only did the pandemic hit just as we were having all of the traction of getting a study underway, with a lot of focus from the key opinion leaders and physicians, other physicians involved, but we also need to raise money. And so as a small company, we don't have the luxury of being, again, a big pharmaceutical company with hundreds of millions of dollars on our balance sheet. We were just in the process of looking at raising money when the pandemic began. So we had to quickly shift gears. As a team of about 25, we put in place what we called the COVID operating budget to make sure we could weather the storm and survive through the pandemic, knowing that clinical studies were largely going to be on hold, and to come out the other side of that in a strong position and to continue to push forward. So we were fortunate, and that was the biggest challenge. But last summer, the summer of 2020, we were able to engage with some top tier healthcare funds, and culminating with a raise that we completed in Q4 of 2020 and uplisting on the NASDAQ. So fortunate to be able to have threaded the needle, but that was without a doubt our biggest challenge, was being able to sustain operations and to be able to continue to push forward.
Yeah, well, congratulations are certainly in order for that alone. And I hadn't planned on asking you this, but since you brought it up, the COVID budget, what there are a lot of companies who are continuing to suffer kind of through clinical operations as this pandemic refuses to release its grip on the patient population. Particularly, in pediatrics, you feel it, I think, in a particularly pointed way. Obviously in geriatric populations, elderly populations, it's put a real strain on those companies. So, looking at that, I guess, conservative approach to budgeting to kind of weather that storm, is there any particular advice that you would give your peers that are seeing some of this for the first time around that? Really kind of where it made sense the most buckle down and kind of bear through it?
Yeah, and I think, back to our earlier part of our discussion, and this comes from, experience, 20, 25 years ago, watching my clients look at, struggling in different sectors, but trying to raise capital, trying to keep the lights on and trying to produce a product, whether it be a biopharmaceutical into clinical development or earlier stage, or something on the tech side. Mm-hmm. And so having seen that and learned from that, one of the things that I think is fundamental is doing everything you can to protect your team, protect the people, because that's really the key asset. So that's first and foremost, is making sure you have resources put in place and are prepared as a senior team, if you need to take sacrifices in terms of your own compensation, and in a variety of ways, such that you can keep a team intact to be able to weather the storm. I like to always say, if you think it's going to be bad, assume it's going to be worse.
Yeah.
And then to really plan around that. So with the capital that we had, I wanted to make sure if we thought we only had, 3/4 of capital, that we wanted to make sure we could stretch that to 6/4 or 7/4 of capital. And you have to take a look at everything that's non-essential and to make sure that you're only spending money on things that are actually going to be meaningful to the business when you come out the other side. And so sometimes you have to make painful trade-offs. But again, I think starts with a team and the people and preserving that, and then having a plan to hopefully, get capital and then to move forward.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you crossed that bridge, and again, congratulations on your recent round.
Thanks.
That's good news heading into the new year. So tell us what's next for RZ358, and I also, I don't want to ignore the fact that this isn't your only candidate. I know you've got some other irons in the fire, so if you want to, give us an overview on those as well, I welcome you to.
Sure, happy to do so. For RZ358, clearly we are focused on this patient population in congenital hyperinsulinism, being in phase 2B, in late stage development. Want nothing more than to get through the study and produce meaningful results, and then to look at phase 3, and hopefully in not the too distant future to have an approved product that actually really does change the lives of these children. And of the families, and gives a whole new armament for the physicians that treat the patient population. So we are definitely focused on that, and we think of ourselves as the congenital hyperinsulinism company from a therapeutic perspective. But as it turns out, hypoglycemia is what our antibody deals with. It deals with the state of hypoglycemia. And there are other diseases and states of the human body where hypoglycemia is problematic. So we are absolutely looking at the possibility of expanded indications and applying our antibody in other areas as well. So nothing at this point to specifically announce or to describe, but suffice it to say, we are absolutely aware of the landscape of hypoglycemia and some of the challenging environments where an antibody like ours would be ideally suited.
Yeah.
In terms of our other pipeline program, which we are excited about, it's very much a different program. It just entered phase 1. So we are dosing patients actively here in the US in a phase 1 study for our program RZ402, which is going after diabetic macular edema. And diabetic macular edema is the leading cause of blindness in the adult population in the US and Europe and other parts of the world. It is a side effect of diabetes. It's not an eye disease, actually. It is a direct result of the cascade and the problems associated with diabetes. It's a vascular leakage disease, microvascular leakage disease into the back of the eye. So when you have diabetes, there are a whole host of complications that can come with diabetes, including in the vasculature. And the vasculature can become permeable. And that's what we see in DME, or diabetic macular edema. Today, that's treated, and there's therapies that are out there that are effective in a lot of patients, which are the anti-VEGF injections. So these are the injections into the eye. Not the ideal route of administration. There are a lot of compliance issues associated with injections into the eye. Patients don't get on therapy, in our opinion, soon enough. And even when they're on therapy, there's a tendency not to have the injections on the frequency that should occur to be able to have real efficacy. In contrast to that, we're bringing forward an oral therapy. We're using a completely different pathway, looking to inhibit the cascade that leads to this vascular leakage. And it's called the kallikrein-kinin system. And so we have a kallikrein inhibitor. And that is an oral therapy, which now is in phase 1. And because it's oral, we can have a pretty quick development pathway going through phase 1 and into phase 2 proof of concept in 2022, which we wouldn't have if we, again, were looking at another injection into the eye, for example, to compete. So potential game changer that we're excited about. We're really motivated by what we've seen in our animal pharmacology, in the doses and concentrations and exposure and ability to inhibit that vascular leakage, and hope to replicate the same in human beings.
Yeah.
So Yeah.
That's that would be a game changer. It's a disease that I think everyone's got experience with. So through loved ones and colleagues and friends, and the standards of care are certainly, to your point, less than ideal.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
As it just occurs to me, Nevan, as it relates to your work in metabolic diseases, I've often said that you don't get a haircut from a guy, from a bartender a barber that is with a bad haircut. And looking at you, you appear to me as though you have the metabolism of an 18-year-old. And I know you've been around much longer than that.
Yeah, well, that's really kind of you. I guess flattery can get you places, but I think I'm just fortunate with good genetics and try to stay active.
Take care of yourself.
Yeah, and otherwise you would see all the white in my hair, but I'm follically challenged. So I thank Michael Jordan in the 1980s for making it cool to shave your head.
Absolutely.
Because I've been doing that for more than 25 years, so I wouldn't walk around looking like Bozo the Clown.
I waffle between the two. If you looked at my LinkedIn profile photo, I'm bald. That's like my summer haircut. And every winter, I'm 45 now, and every winter I attempt to grow it back, and I realize that it's the comb over is getting a little bit more noticeable. So it's only a matter of time before I'm right there with you.
Well, right now though, you're living the dream. You can do it whatever you want. So, and you're in your mid 40s. I say you're in extra time. So that's great.
That's right. Any concluding thoughts, Nevan, that you wanted to share with our audience? Any, I guess, maybe pearls of wisdom or advice for those new and first-time biopharma execs who are kind of starting down, charting the path that you began some 10 plus years ago?
Well, Matt, I definitely enjoyed the conversation, and pearls of wisdom, for what it's worth. Only thing I would say is that what I've learned from others that have taught me and learned from those that I've just observed as well is the importance of maintaining a positive attitude and being able to stay focused on what your goals are, recognizing there will be challenges, but having that positive attitude and maintaining that attitude with your team is fundamental, because anything less than that can often lead to the opposite of success. So that would be the only thought I would have to share. But I enjoyed the conversation, and I appreciate you having me on your show.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you joining us, and that's sound advice from a man who's been there and done that in many, to my earlier points, many industries. So thank you for joining us, and congratulations on your success to date. We'll be following along and hoping for the best for you and Rezolute. Thanks again, Matt. Really appreciate it. So that's Nevan Elam. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with Cytiva, which, along with this podcast, is celebrating its 1-year anniversary this month. Learn more about Cytiva's commitment to the innovation happening in new and emerging biopharma at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. And please visit bioprocessonline.com, where you can catch up on all the episodes of this podcast and sign up for my newsletter while you're at it. In the meantime, subscribe to the pod, listen to more conversations like this one, give us 5 stars, and thanks for listening.